Okay. All right, folks, welcome. I'm so excited everyone is here. It's a wonderful crowd here. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening for the SSP/SSR faculty talk, which we hold every other Thursday. Normally it's just for us faculty, but one of the silver linings of COVID is that we're able to do this virtually and open this up to the larger community. So I'm very pleased to say today that it's not just faculty members, we have students, we have folks from the Canterbury community, we have folks from London, we have folks from Canada, we have folks from mainland Europe. I think we have some folks from the US as well, including our speaker. So this talk is being recorded. We're going to post it online on the university website and on YouTube. So if you are not able to stay for the whole time, we will have this for posterity's sake. This talk is also part of our ongoing programming with the Center for the Study of Social and Political Movements at the University of Kent, of which I am a co-director. And I'm also pleased to say that our speaker today is an affiliate of the International Association of Vegan Sociologists, which I am a co-founder. And so without further ado, I will introduce them. And his name is Vasile Stănescu. He is an associate professor of communication at Mercer University in beautiful Georgia in the United States. He's a co-editor of the Critical Animal Studies book series, which is published by Rodopi or Brill, and the co-founder of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies, the former co-editor of the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, the former co-organizer for the Stanford Environmental Humanities Project. He is the author of over 20 peer-reviewed publications on the study of the critical study of non-human animals and the environment. And I can very much so vouch for him as someone also in this field, one of my absolute favorite authors and speakers. And before I turn it over to him, I just want you to keep in mind regarding today's topic that here at the University of Kent, they were quite slow, a bit lag when it comes to dealing with sustainability issues and the environment. But the university has set a target of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2040. It's already planning to engage with students, staff, and other folks in order to get that target slightly earlier by 2035. The university actually just sent out an email about an hour ago asking for our feedback. So the sustainability team is keen to hear what we think about their plans. And I'm going to post a link in the chat where you can have your say. So I encourage you to listen to today's talk, think about it critically, and then maybe put these into action and try to make a difference here at the University of Kent in our larger Canterbury community. The city of Canterbury also has declared a crisis, climate change crisis, is currently accepting feedback from the community. All right, so shall I turn it over to you, Vasile?
Thank you very much. Before I start, I want to make first a comment about accessibility. As earlier mentioned, the talk will be recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube if people find it easier to pause, take breaks, or rewash. When it's uploaded to YouTube, it will be closed captioned there as well. The talk is not yet ready to send, but if you send me an email as soon as it's ready for publication, if it's easier for you to read, let me know, and I'm happy to send it that way. Before I start, I'd also like to start with a thank you to Dr. Corey Wren. We first met each other over 5 years ago at a conference in Canada. The theme was animal oppression and capitalism. One of the things I most believe in is a scholar activist, and I can think of no one who better personifies that than Corey. So it is an honor for you to have invited me to speak here today. The world is on fire. Animal agriculture, climate change, and the path forward. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. Greta Thunberg. Part 1, our planet is burning. The world is on fire. This is not an extreme statement. This is an understatement. In November 2019, Australia was consumed in fire. Over 150 fires raged across Australia in every single Australian state. The fires lasted for 4 months. More than 1 million hectares, 27.2 million acres of Australia burned. For comparison, that is a size larger than North Korea. The smoke from the fires could be filmed from outer space. Nearly 3 billion animals were killed or displaced by the fires. As the WWF Australia CEO Dermot Orgam phrased it, this ranks as the worst wildlife disaster in modern history. Because of these fires, Australia's koala population are now in imminent risk of extinction. The reason for these fires? Climate change. As a report in the BBC phrased it, scientists have long warned that a hotter, drier climate will contribute to fires becoming more frequent and more intense. Many parts of Australia have been in drought conditions, some for years, which has made it easier for the fires to spread and grow. Australia broke its all-time temperature record twice in December. However, as devastating as these fires were, they're only a precursor of what is to come. As Chris Dickman, an ecologist at the University of Sydney put it, we're looking at what climate change will look like for the other parts of the world in its first stages in Australia. In September 2020, less than a year later, California experienced its single worst wildfires on record. The fires killed 31 people, destroyed over 10,000 buildings, and burned 4.1 million acres. According to an article in The Guardian, 5 of the 6 largest blazes in the history of the state were all recorded in 2020. The fires were so intense, they had to coin a new term to describe them, a gigafire. A fire so large that a single blaze covers over 1 million acres. As Daniel Swain, a climate scientist at UCLA's Institute for the Environment and Sustainability put it, there's no statistic, no dimension of the fire season in California in 2020 that was not astonishing or horrifying. As with Australia, the cause is clear: climate change. Perhaps the organization Climate Central put it best: these are not just random events. Climate change is producing conditions ripe for wildfires, tipping the scales in favor of the dramatic increases in large wildfires we have seen. Again, as bad as these weather conditions are, they are just the prelude of the events that are coming. Andrew Dressler, a climate scientist at Texas A&M, stated, "If you don't like all the climate disasters happening in 2020, I have some bad news for you for the rest of your life." Not only is the world burning, it's freezing. On February 2021, the United States experienced the polar vortex. Texas, historically one of the hottest states in the United States, froze. And in the midst of the coldest temperatures in the recorded history of Texas, because the power plants had not been winterized, the power went out. Overnight, 5 million people lost power. At one point in Texas, the temperature dipped to 3 degrees below that of Alaska. People contracted monoxide poisoning because they were trying to stay warm in their cars. The cause? Climate change. As Judah Cohen, the director of seasonal forecasting and atmospheric and environmental research phrased it, the current conditions in Texas are historical, certainly generational, but it can't be hand-waved away as if it's something that is entirely natural. This is not happening in spite of climate change, it's due to climate change. In 2020, the United States Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, "The past decade was the hottest on record." Scientists tell us that ocean temperatures are now rising at the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs a second. 1 million species are in near danger of extinction. Quote, "Our planet is burning." However, my goal here today is not to be apocalyptic. Too often, the move in terms of climate change is from "there's nothing we need to do" to immediately "there's nothing we can do," without anything in the room in the middle for action. According to the IPCC, while we cannot stop climate change, since climate change is already happening, if we act now, we can still prevent the worst effects of climate change. The IPCC released a report that stated that we have a 12-year window that gives us a 50% chance to avoid the truly apocalyptic impacts of climate change. Specifically, we have to cut carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions 45% by 2030, and then keep cutting emissions further to net zero by 2050. Such a move, the report claims, will keep the projected increase below the 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius change seen as necessary to prevent the most devastating impacts from climate change. The problem, that report is now 3 years old. And while there was a decline in emissions due to COVID, those emissions are already rebounding. We are quite literally running out of time. Part 2, urgent action is required. One of the single largest causes of GHG emissions is animal agriculture. The governmental and peer-reviewed research on this topic is numerous and definitive. In 2006, 15 years ago, the UN's FAO produced a 391-page report entitled Livestock's Long Shadow, concluding that animal farming presents, quote, a major threat to the environment with such deep and wide-ranging impact that it should rank as a leading focus for environmental policy. The report concluded that the livestock sector is a major player in climate change, responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions measured in their CO2 equivalent. That is a higher share than transport. Nor was this call or action at all hidden. As Henning Steinfeld, chief of FAO's Livestock Information and Policy Branch, put it, livestock are one of the most significant contributors to today's most serious environmental problems. Urgent action is required to remedy the situation. Furthermore, the former chair of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, repeatedly suggested that people should decrease their consumption of meat in order to help offset climate change. As he stated in 2008, in terms of the immediacy of action and the feasibility of bringing about reductions in a short period of time, decreasing meat consumption clearly is the most attractive opportunity. In 2017, a peer-reviewed study in the journal Climatic Change determined that if Americans just switched beef for beans, this one change alone would achieve 46 to 74% of the reductions needed to meet the 2020 greenhouse gas target for the entire United States. In 2018, in the most comprehensive study on the topic to date, based on a massive data set of the greenhouse gas emissions of a full life cycle analysis of 40,000 farms in 119 countries, covering 40 food products, the lead researcher, Joseph Poore, at the University of Oxford concluded, quote, a vegan diet is the single best way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. It is far bigger than cutting down on your flights. It is far bigger than buying an electric car. In 2020, a peer-reviewed study in Science concluded that the projected carbon emissions from our food system alone would make it impossible to achieve the Paris Climate Accords or prevent the 1.5 degree changes in temperature. Quote, even if all fossil fuels were eliminated immediately, emissions from the global food system alone would make it impossible to limit warnings to 1.5 degrees Celsius and difficult to even realize the 2-degree target. Even more definitively, also in 2020, the OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook again concluded that food-related greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to double by 2050, preventing any chance of keeping global temperature rise below the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold. The single largest drivers of these emissions, animal agriculture. Another study published just this month, March 2021, again determined that food systems are responsible for 1/3 of global anthropogenic GHG emissions. Indeed, that was the title of the study. The single largest drivers of these emissions, animal agriculture. There are hundreds, of peer-reviewed studies and governmental reports, which have all reached the same conclusion. I cannot go through them all with you today because I only have 45 minutes for this presentation. Unfortunately, many people respond to climate change as if it was a belief statement, that the important part is that they believe in climate change, that they publicly state that climate change is real or happening. However, believing in climate change in a vacuum will accomplish nothing. To ignore animal agriculture's effect on climate change is to be a climate change denier. Believing in climate change means reading and doing what the peer-reviewed research says we should do about climate change, and that is a government-funded, massive, across-the-board decrease in global meat consumption. And as terrible as animal agriculture is in terms of climate change, it is even worse in terms of habitat loss and species extinction. For example, a peer-reviewed study examined 17,000 species. They concluded that by 2030, if no changes are made, animal agriculture could threaten all of them. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity estimates as high as 150 species are going extinct each day. The single largest cause? Animal agriculture. A report by Chapman, published in February 2021, tried to phrase it this way to contextualize the degree that animal agriculture has destroyed biodiversity and driven species extinction. Quote, since 1970, the collective weight of wild animals has declined by 82%. Instead of wild animals, a small number of farmed animal species now dominate global biomass. Together, they account for 60% of all mammalian species by mass, compared to 4% for wild animals. When I published my first article on animal agriculture and its effects on the environment, we raised and killed approximately 60 billion land animals a year. Currently, it is estimated at 80 billion. By 2050, the number is projected to grow to 120 billion. 26% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is used for livestock grazing. 1/3 of the planet's arable land is occupied by livestock feed crop cultivation. By comparison, the amount of land used for urban living, every city combined, is less than 1%. Grazeland and pasture land alone consumes acreage larger than the entire continent of Africa. And these are current numbers. These numbers do not take into the projected increase by 2030. They do not take into account the projected doubling by 2050. However, there is no way to double a practice that already consumes more than half of all of the available land on the planet. We are running out of time. We are running out of room. Part 3, a hope in hell. Unfortunately, the most common and promoted response, including by many vegans and animal advocates, to this massive environmental effect of animal agriculture are 3 consumerist options, none of which will solve the problem, and 2 of which will actually make the problem worse. The first solution that is advocated is to return to a supposed earlier time in animal agriculture, which is believed to be more environmentally sustainable. The precise terminology used is slightly different and constantly changes. Sometimes it's referred to as locavorism, which refers to animals raised within a certain geographic region. Free range, cage-free, or pasture-raised refers to the absence of certain confinement strategies. Organic or grass-fed refers to the type of feed. Rotational grazing or regenerative farming refers to specific strategies used to manage cattle grazing, as well as certain restorative practices done to the land not directly related to the grazing itself. However, while the list is long and seemingly constantly changing, I think it is more accurate to think of the arguments for and against such practices together. At least in terms of how they affect the environment, these practices are largely similar. Specifically, several peer-reviewed studies have found either minimum benefit or in some cases significant environmental harm in local, free-range, grass-fed animal farms, worse in some cases than even the factory farms that these types of farms are supposed to replace. For example, researchers have found little benefit to the local aspect of animal agriculture, instead finding the transportation of greenhouse gas emissions, the GHG for animal agriculture, are relatively minor, and specifically in the last stage of transmission, i.e. from producer to consumer, virtually negligible. Indeed, a study that focused on whether a local or a vegetarian diet is more helpful in terms of reducing greenhouse gases concluded that shifting from beef to vegetables for even a single day a week would in fact be more helpful in reducing greenhouse gases than shifting the entirety of one's diet to exclusively locally produced sources. Likewise, Nathan Peetlitter has estimated that grass-fed and pasture-raised cattle actually result in a 50% increase in GHG emissions than cattle raised on a factory farm. As Peetlitter explained as an interview on his research, quote, "We do see significant differences in greenhouse gas intensities of grass versus grain finishing. It's roughly on the order 50% higher for grass-finished systems." In contrast, Peetlitter has estimated that replacing all meat with soy or other plant-based protein would decrease the GHG emission from protein creation in the Western diet by 96%. Likewise, Adrian Williams of Cranford University in England found that free-range and organic raised chicken have a 20% greater impact in global warming than chickens raised in factory farm conditions. He also found that organic eggs are 14% higher on their impact on climate than factory farm eggs. The main reason for these counterintuitive results is because free-range animals take longer to gain weight, consume more feed, take up more room, and produce both more burps and flatulence. For example, a study in 2012 by Judith Kapler determined that if we switched to all grass-fed beef in the United States, it would require an additional 64.6 million cows, 131 million acres more land, and 135 million more tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And specifically, if all the US beef produced in 2010 were grass-fed, all of the land in the states of New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Ohio combined would be required to meet this demand. Indeed, the previously mentioned study by POR, which analyzed the environmental effects of 40,000 farms, specifically studied grass-fed beef. POR did determine a large variability in the environmental effects of different types of animal husbandry practices. For example, cows raised on deforested land resulted in 12 times more greenhouse gas emissions than those raised on pre-existing pasture. However, in all cases, the environmental effects of animal agriculture, regardless of the method used, were still significant and far worse than any plant-based alternative. Even the lowest environmental beef still exercises 6 times the greenhouse gas emissions and 36 times the land use of any plant protein. As POR phrased the same point in an interview about his research, quote, "Converting grass into meat is like converting coal to energy. It comes with an intense cost in emissions." Perhaps the management strategy which occupies the most current interest is regenerative farming, based on the idea that carbon sequestration of properly managed grasslands could effectively offset the carbon production of cattle. However, peer-reviewed information supporting these claims are not strong. In one of the only peer-reviewed studies I could locate that suggested rotational grazing and regenerative farming could be net positive, the author still cautioned that such results were not scalable, that any benefit might be temporary as over time grass simply absorbs less carbon, and that achieve even these temporary benefits, the authors had to assume no use of fertilizer, no use of any feed crops, no conversion of any new grasslands, no killing of any predatory animals, and no irrigation of any kind. If the energy used just for irrigation was factored in, even these temporary benefits vanished. In other words, all of the conditions, weather, rainfall, soil consistency, soil nutrients, plant species, stocking rates, the number of cattle per acre, all had to be just right. But they almost never are. Tara Garnett at the Food Climate Research Network at Oxford University has extensively studied regenerative farming. Her conclusion is that even if in theory, regenerative farming could provide some benefit, in practice, it always produces more carbon emissions and more environmental harm. As Garnett phrased it in a particularly candid interview about her research, we can't escape the fact that if we are going to have a hope in hell of cutting our climate emissions, then we need to stop our consumption of animal products. And that holds whatever the animal type and whatever the system in which it's been produced. Part 4, an Oxford study. The second proposed solution to the environmental effects of animal agriculture is in vitro meat. For example, the first study on in vitro meat concluded that in vitro meat would produce an outstanding 78 to 98% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 99% reduction in land use, 80 to 96% reduction in water use, and a 45% reduction in energy use. In turn, these same statistics have been widely cited uncritically in newspaper articles on the topic, as well as on the website of the producers of in vitro meat themselves. For example, Bloomberg ran an article in 2013 in favor of in vitro meat, in which they claimed, quote, a University of Oxford study of culture meat estimated a 90% savings of all resources, including feed, water, land, water disposal, and greenhouse gas emissions over the massive environmental cost of animal husbandry, which of course sounds very convincing. However, what Bloomberg or virtually any of the other media outlets failed to report is that the study was both commissioned and funded exclusively by the in vitro meat industry, was in fact not an Oxford study in any meaningful sense of that term, but was published by a single PhD candidate who happened to be attending Oxford at the time, and was based solely on a series of possible thought experiments, assumptions, which involved no actual measurements or experimentation, and were premised on a series of technologies which currently do not exist, and a series of assumptions which are unlikely to ever occur. To provide one example among many, the study assumed that all in vitro meat would be grown exclusively in cyanobacteria hydrostate, a type of algae, even though no in vitro meat is currently cultivated in this process, and there is no current research proving that it would be able to do so in the future. Unsurprisingly, I have been not able to locate a single additional peer-reviewed study which has duplicated these results. Instead, later research has concluded that in vitro meat would be, just like free-range farming, more harmful in terms of climate change than even conventionally produced factory farm meat. As one recent peer-reviewed study concluded, quote, cultivation of in vitro meat requires more industrial energy, often produced by burning fossil fuels, than pork, poultry, and maybe even beef. The reason for these counterintuitive results is that while culture meat uses less land, it uses more energy inputs, i.e. fossil fuels, than even factory farms. As a thoughtful article in The Atlantic further explained, cell culture is one of the most resource-intensive techniques in modern biology. Keeping the cells warm, healthy, well-fed, and free of contamination takes incredible energy, even when scaled to the 10,000-liter vats the biotech companies use. And on top of that, the fact that these three-dimensional wads of meat have to be exercised regularly with stretching machinery, essentially elaborate meat gyms, and you begin to understand the incredible challenges of in vitro meat. Therefore, while in vitro meat would certainly use less land than conventional meat, it is still not scalable, as it requires more energy inputs and therefore produces more greenhouse gas emissions. As Marco Spingman, a postgraduate researcher at Oxford, phrased the same critique. Although the technologies are evolving, there is no indication that lab-grown meat is significantly better for the environment than existing alternatives to beef. The latest peer-reviewed studies have put the emissions of lab-grown meat at several times that of chicken and far above any plant-based alternative. Finally, it is a solution without a problem. If the problem really was a lack of tasty meat-like products, that problem has already been solved. Impossible Meat already exists, is actually environmentally sustainable and scalable, and has already been mass deployed to restaurants around the world. For example, Burger King, and most importantly, in multiple taste tests, people who eat meat, even Michael Pollan himself, cannot tell which is the Impossible Burger and which is the conventional one. The fact that the Impossible Burger has not ended or even decreased the rate of animal agriculture, a point I will return to, simply underscores that the problem is not, nor ever has been, a lack of consumerist options, and therefore the solution cannot be yet another consumerist option, particularly when this one, just like grass-fed beef, is almost certainly going to have a worse impact on global warming than even CAFOs. Part 5, great marketing. The last solution, wildly touted by some well-funded animal rights organization, is the creation of new forms of vegan substitutes. For example, the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat. To be clear, these are net positives. Unlike either grass-fed or in vitro, they're environmentally beneficial and actually scalable. I'm glad they exist. It is not my argument they should be boycotted or anything of that nature. However, I include them here because on their own and via a consumerist option, they will never achieve their purported gains. The reason is because of something called the vegan halo effect. Perhaps the best example of the vegan halo effect is Doc Martens. In order to help revive its image as a progressive company, its mission statement is literally empowering rebellious self-expression. Doc Marten, a producer of leather boots, came out with vegan Doc Martens. The result was that while Doc Marten did sell some vegan Doc Martens, sales of the original leather boots also increased at a far larger rate, tripling the company's profits. The conclusion is that the creation of vegan Doc Martens changed the way that the brand as a whole was perceived as more progressive and more radical, even if in reality, most people kept buying the non-vegan leather shoes. The same result is what happened in terms of the Impossible Burger and Burger King. While counterintuitive, the reality seems to be that adding in new vegan options can lead to an increase of meat sales. Part of the reason these meat alternatives are desirable by a business is that they make the company as a whole seem more ethical or sustainable, even when it is not, the so-called vegan halo effect. So the launch of the Impossible Burger at Burger King correlated not only with sales of the Impossible Whopper, but also with an actual increase of the sales of the traditional Whopper. As an article in The Guardian phrased this phenomenon, a business is adding vegan options to improve the company's image in order to increase the sale of their non-vegan items. Quote, one way of looking at this is that veganism is great for business. Another is that vegan sausage rolls are a great marketing tool for pork sausage rolls. It is unclear to me how this represents much of a victory. Indeed, this is actually Burger King's third veggie burger they have sold. If one goes back and reads the article on the previous versions, they are also launched with great fanfare, large sale numbers, and consequently pronouncements of impending success by PETA and some other animal rights activists. However, each of these earlier options, despite initial surges of popularity, failed to produce much in the way of long-term success. And that is what we are already seeing in terms of these new meat alternatives. For example, Tim Hortons in Canada recently ended all sales of Beyond Meat because of slow sales. Likewise, Burger King, after an initial surge, is now experiencing declining sales. Hardee's in the United States has already added in and discounted its plant-based burgers. Companies introduce new niche food items all the time as a way to generate buzz and interest in their products. However, it is not clear how these new meats are much different in effect than, say, Popeye's chicken sandwiches or McDonald's decision to sell breakfast all day in the US context. It may make some short-term profit for various companies involved. They may even keep the products once the sales decline. However, overall, it is unclear how such marketing changes represent any real form of progress. It is the identical reason that fast food restaurants sell salads. Unsurprisingly, virtually no one orders a salad at a fast food burger restaurant. It's something like 1.2% of sales. Why do they keep it on the menu? The purpose is not to sell salads. The purpose is to make the menu and the chain as a whole seem healthier. In a larger sense, to the degree that we're focusing on the sales of products at all, we are focused on the wrong metric. What we should be focused on, I believe, is not more sales of this or that vegan option, but declining sales of animal products. And that very much is not happening. In fact, meat sales worldwide have been steadily increasing. According to FAO, the total number of animals killed last year increased by 2.2 billion in a single year. Finally, it is important to note that the meat industry itself is actively funding and creating ever more authentic tasting meat alternatives. The reason is not to trade off with the pre-existing meat sales. It is, as with Burger King, to greenwash the industry, i.e. the vegan halo effect, and to serve as a possible filler for meat sales, i.e. fake meat that can be successfully blended with meat products. One of the very first investors in Beyond Meat was Tyson. This was not because Tyson planned to put itself out of business. For example, Tyson has already produced a product called Raised and Rooted. It combines beef and pea protein into a single product. It is not vegan. It is made from beef. However, its appeal is to further confuse consumers and ultimately further expand meat sales. Likewise, Purdue has already brought to market a product called Chicken Plus, which combines chicken and cauliflower. Again, this product is intended not to trade off with meat sales, but marketed as a way to use meat to get children to, quote, eat their veggies in, quote, the fun dino shapes that kids love. It is a self-conscious plan of how the meat industry plans to double its production, in part by adding ever more accurate tasting fillers to blend in with pre-existing meat. None of this is to say that fake meat substitutes cannot have a role to play in combating climate change. They may. However, it cannot happen via the current process of individualistic consumer choices. Such decisions are, at least currently, not decreasing the number of animals raised or killed, increasing meat sales, increasing profits for meat companies, and helping to create more blended products to match the reality of animal agriculture and the trade-off with the sales of non-meat food sources. Expressed differently, we need the ethics first and the products second. What we keep trying to do is create the products first and hope the ethics will follow. However, as all these examples listed here make clear, this will never work. Conclusion, what will work? Veganism as a social justice movement in solidarity with other social justice movements. Our single most important goal is that veganism should not be thought of in terms of a diet or a consumerist life choice. It is not. It is a social justice movement that contains, as one part among many, a series of ethical choices concerning food. As the previous examples highlight, the number one way in which the animal liberation movement has gone astray has been to view veganism as a diet, as a consumerist life choice dependent upon capitalism, i.e. vote with your dollars, as opposed to a necessary outgrowth of a social justice movement based on animal liberation. As with prior social justice movements, which included a boycott aspect, the point is not, nor has ever been, exactly the boycott. It has always operated as part of a larger movement for social justice. In other words, the current mindset seems to be to try to depoliticize animal liberation in order to make it more palpable. Instead of saying we are vegan, we are told to say that we are vegetarian. Instead of vegetarian, we are told to refer to something as plant-based. Instead of plant-based, call it plant-strong, whatever that even means. I think that goal is exactly wrong. Our goal cannot be to simply trick consumers into consuming a few more plant-based meals. As the earlier examples make clear, this will accomplish nothing. Instead, we must clearly articulate and fight for veganism as a necessary outgrowth of a visible manifestation of a deeper social justice movement, combining environmentalism and animal liberation. When understood and articulated as a social justice movement, veganism must then be articulated in solidarity with other social justice movements. Virtually every vegan pamphlet I have ever read has assumed an imagined and stereotypical white, female, middle-class subjecthood. It emphasizes health. It talks about the amount of water that is being wasted. It urges me to make the compassionate choice. What I almost never see, excluding, say, the work of the Food Empowerment Project, is a clear and direct conversation about the way that meat eating is directly related to and continues to uphold systems of colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. Although this history is equally as true as well documented as anything currently found in those flyers. Likewise, within vegan outreach flyers, I rarely read about how food deserts and dietary racism directly hurt people of color, how environmental racism, fueled by agriculture-caused climate change, will uniquely and disproportionately harm people of color, how factory farm conditions are, in essence, legalized violence against the primarily immigrants and people of color who work at them, and the people of color who are forced to live around them. I have never read about how the only reason we eat meat at the levels we currently do is that cheap meat was produced as a way to prop up white male masculinity of the working class, a chicken in every pot, without having to increase union wages. The truth is that veganism is not a white elitist movement. In the United States, African Americans are disproportionately likely to become vegan and the single fastest growing demographic for new vegans. In Atlanta, Georgia, where I lived, beside my house, there are 6 vegan restaurants, all African American owned and operated. But it is a movement that is white elitist dominated. I watched in horror during Black Lives Matter as vegan posted all lives matter memes to suggest that animal lives should also matter. Dr. Breeze Harper organized a conference entitled Vegan Praxis of Black Lives Matter. She received a host of aggressive emails from white vegans. As she phrases it, I've gotten a significant number of white vegans responding to the theme of my conference with everyone matters or all lives matter. Maybe you don't know it, but saying all lives matter or everyone matters are racial microaggressions, and they do not help with our collective struggle with racial battle fatigue. Christopher Sebastian has critiqued this practice of white vegans shifting Black Lives Matter into all lives matter in these terms. When radical Black protest becomes popular, Black erasure always follows. Likewise, for many years now, PETA has posted dog breeding by having protesters wear Ku Klux Klan hoods. In February 2008, they even released an ad of a man wearing full Klan regalia attending a dog breed meeting. Look, I'm opposed to dog breeding. I'm also opposed to the use of the iconography of racial terror as an effective means to build cross-movement solidarity. As the periodical Color Lines phrase these critiques of the ad, quote, what the ad doesn't mention or depict is the beating, castration, hanging, and burning of Black people, but the image of Klan member and full regalia conjured up this violence. In 2012, PETA produced an ad mocking public service ads about domestic violence. The joke is that eating vegetables would make men so great in bed, they would inevitably leave their girlfriends bruised and beaten. And Peter Singer, the supposed father of animal rights, has been steadfast in his commitment to the worst kinds of ableism and eugenics. Rather, it's disability, gender, trans rights, classism, race, immigration. The most well-known images and iconography of the animal rights movement has been, and often continues to be, horrible. It is hard to imagine a movement which has operated less intersectionally, but we must. And to be clear, we must do so not only because it is the right thing to do and to help animals, but because it is in and of itself the right thing to do. The reason to confront anti-Blackness is not primarily because white vegans must build solidarity with African Americans to further animal liberation. The reason we should confront anti-Blackness is because we believe in and support confronting anti-Blackness. Veganism is not a diet. Veganism is a social justice movement based on the idea that one cannot own someone else, that consent always matters, that all animals, including humans, matter for their own reasons, and not because they can be used for the pleasure of another group. If we keep telling people what we want is health, we will get healthier meat options. If we tell people we want animal liberation, maybe we will start to actually get animal liberation. Relatedly, we must support a series of progressive laws around the environment, animal rights, and intersectional social justice. Nation Rising is currently fighting to stop the host of ways that governments directly financially support meat and dairy. This is a great place to start. How can an economic boycott of animal agriculture ever succeed when the government simply bails out effective animal farms as they now routinely do? Let's put the call that animals have the right to sexual consent, the right to refuse sexual partners they do not want, on ballot initiatives on parliaments throughout the world. That one right, if enacted, would virtually end all forms of animal agriculture overnight. Let's let the meat industry run ads to explain to consumers that sexual violence is essential for the industry to be able to run at all. And most importantly, let us not be single issue in our demands or allyships. Virtually every progressive law or cause is helpful for animal rights. Since the oppressions are interrelated, so too must be the solutions. Raising the minimum wage in the United States directly translates into lower profits for factory farms and fast food restaurants, the largest sellers of meat products. Reforming our immigration laws directly translates into tax on CAFOs, since at least in the US context, they directly recruit undocumented labor, ruthlessly exploit them, and then routinely call in ICE to deport them whenever they try to unionize. Fights for prison abolition inevitably trade off with agriculture labor, as a prison industrial system exploits primarily Black and brown labor at below minimum wage conditions in order to do the work of animal husbandry. Fights against environmental racism are inevitably fights against factory farms. Fights against food deserts inevitably make fruits and vegetables more accessible to more people. And as this presentation has made crystal clear, any law that is sincere in its attempt to address climate change has to include limitations on eating meat. This is how we win, by making allies, not with, as some would have us believe, factory farms. This will inevitably fail and harm us, but with the wealth of social justice movements, all of whom we should be supporting, not only because this will translate into helping animals, but because they are the right things to support in and of themselves. I do not claim that this will be easy or one-directional. Some vegans and animal rights activists may have areas and blind spots around issues of anti-Blackness or disability or transphobia. Indeed, I am sure they do, where they will need to be educated. Other groups in areas of speciesism and anthropocentrism may need people from these affected groups already in the animal right community to reach out to them. However, we must find areas of solidarity and commonality. I've heard Peter Singer speak on a number of occasions. Often he receives the identical question, but what about capitalism? Every time he is given the identical answer. I think we have enough on our plate dealing with animals without confronting capitalism. However, from the cap in capitalism, referring to the head of cattle, to Henry Ford studying the disassembly plants of the Chicago slaughterhouse to invent the new assembly lines of mechanized production, to the earlier mentioned forgotten history of the support of cheap meat as a way to buy off the working class, capitalism and speciesism have always worked together as interrelated and co-constitutive phenomenon. On a deeper level, the argument of animal liberation is that all animal life, including human, is more than a mere product or resource that can be simply bought or sold. There's a popular meme that one cannot be a meat-eating environmentalist. This is true. However, I would add one cannot be a capitalist vegan, viewing veganism as only a diet, focusing on ever new consumerist options, voting with our dollars, depoliticizing our movement, staying resolutely single issue, limiting ourselves to options that are supportive of capitalism and profit, helping to greenwash, praise, and work with factory farms to develop the very technologies they need to double the meat supply. That is how we lose. Articulating veganism as a social justice movement, building solidarity with other social justice movements, and working together to enact widespread legal and political change, that is how we win. That is our path forward. Thank you.
Woo, you're on a roll. Thank you so much. The chat boxes, you're bringing down the house, if we can judge by the chat box over here. Thank you so much. very thought-provoking, and gave me a lot, honestly, a lot to think about and reconsider. We have a good 30 minutes for questions now. So if people are still going, wow, that's brilliant. Does anyone have a question? My head is spinning. There's so much to think about with that.
I do.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that hand. Who was that, Marv? You want to go ahead?
Okay. I hope I'm not jumping the queue.
It's all right.
I would just want to be a little more specific. I mean, your talk was magnificent in every way in terms of its breadth and depth. But agriculture globally is a founded and controlled apparatus, albeit in its capitalist form, as you quite truthfully articulated. But I don't think we can develop remedies for animal exploitation and climate change maladies without fully reifying the causes. Even in vitro science is based in this paradigm of male dominance. Of course, in the West, white male dominance. But that is the bedrock, I think, for this system. And we have to always include it as that sort of foundation stone. Otherwise, we're missing a certain sense of concreteness in our understanding and analysis. So what do you think of that position? I know you mentioned, sexism, but it seemed like it was just one among many rather than sort of a base.
If I understood your question correctly, you're talking about the importance of sexism in fueling global meat production. I could not agree with you more. The reason that I first went vegan was reading The Sexual Politics of Meat. What stood with me was the idea that for chickens and dairy cows, what is being exploited is their very femaleness. What I would add to that is that all the time we hear this claim that you can't be a meat-eating feminist. But I would say you can't be a vegan who is not a feminist. We have serious problems of sexism throughout the animal rights movement, including highly credible examples of violence against young women who come into this movement from older men. And until we take that quite seriously and stop using the half-truth of you can't be a feminist and a meat eater to not reflect on the ways that we ourselves as vegans are perpetuating patriarchy, then we're not going to get very far.
Thanks, Marv. So I'm going to move down the list. I think Joe Warner, did you have a question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for that really, really interesting stuff. On the relationship between capitalism and veganism as a social justice movement, I guess I'm tempted to say for me, it's a bit of a chicken and egg debate. And I come down very firmly on the side of the idea that capitalism is the driver for, basically all of these ills which are expressed in these different ways you've described very well. And if that is true, let's suppose for the moment it is true, then how far is veganism as a social movement actually going to get us, social justice movement actually going to get us, in light of the fact that the driver for these multiple oppressions is ultimately, in crude terms, profit, global corporations, machinery that, as we've already seen, has no real interest in fundamental change, but its interest is not actually fundamentally in oppressing animals. Its interest is solely generating profit through hyper-consumerism, neoliberal forms of managerialism, managing even the human soul, you know. So I have to say I'm not persuaded yet that really the fundamental struggle is still not. And what worries me about some of the social justice movements as framed is that I don't think people are necessarily articulating in the way that we need to about the problem of capitalism and political economy in that sense. So that is what I would. So I guess my question would be, what if that's true?
So I think that you create a false dichotomy. I don't think that we have to choose. Rather, we critique capitalism, or rather we critique speciesism. In the same way, we don't have to choose. Rather, we critique capitalism and anti-Blackness. I think it is wholly possible, indeed I would say absolutely necessary, that we engage in a complicated, multifaceted critique that involves multiple ways in which oppression operates. So I have historical examples to go through of the way that the two movements have functioned together, and I mentioned some of those in the talk today, specifically the way that unionization within the United States, the white male working class, was bought off by cheap meat. So their demands for meat were like, hey, immigrants are coming in. They claimed, we can't, our wages are going down, we can't buy the meat that we want. The solution was to make meat as cheap as possible. If you read Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals, he gives this weird apocryphic story of how factory farms happened. Supposedly people accidentally delivered way too many chickens and they decided to create the factory farm system. This is an amusing story, but obviously untrue. What was the reason? What was the problem that factory farms are created to solve? The reason, the problem, were people demanding higher wages, and they were bought off with ever cheaper meat. Most products have gone up, meat steadily has gotten cheaper. But the point isn't even that history. The point is we don't have to choose. We can fight against capitalism. Indeed, we must. Indeed, I'm highly critical of any form of veganism that fails to engage with critiques of capitalism, and we can fight against speciesism at the same time. The last little bit that I would add is that getting rid of capitalism will not in and of itself get rid of speciesism any more than it would get rid of any other form of oppression. For example, for many years, my neighbor had a dog they kept chained outside all the time. This had nothing to do with money. It had nothing to do with protein. At some level, they just wanted to. One day, the dog died.
Thank you, Joe. Jonathan, I think you had your physical hand up if you want to go next.
Thank you. I sent the question to Vasile in the chat, but I can read it. Is the increase in meat consumption globally a false alarm in terms of the West? In that the increase is the increase not more likely to come from the increase in meat consumption in Asia and Africa, where increasing affluence is leading to increased meat consumption, than what you seem to be suggesting was that meat consumption is increasing anyway in the West, despite these attempts to promote veganism?
Yeah, I mean, so you're correct. The primary global drivers of increased meat consumptions are not directly increased affluence. People could have increased affluence and spend it in a host of different ways, but increased population, increased affluence, and an increased belief that meat is the best way to express this affluence, a kind of quote unquote westernization of countries such as India and China, which have traditionally eaten historically low amounts of meat, have very high populations, are now shifting to high amounts of meat. So for example, India, which has historically a fairly large vegetarian population, 500 million, has already decreased by 100 million. They're currently at 400 million. Wow. So if you take, say, 500 million people and switch them from a vegetarian diet to a meat diet, then you're going to have massive environmental harm. But the 2 points I would push back on is that somehow what we're doing in the West isn't related to that. Well, that's exactly wrong. Why are they choosing to spend this money on meat? Is because of kind of fetishization of West, and our eating meat is then the meat, helps to influence them to eat meat. And additionally, it's just not factually true that the amount of meat in the West isn't increasing. It is.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Esther from the Animal Think Tank. It's good to see you here. Esther, I can't really hear you.
I can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now? So I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about how you think the efforts behind economic justice could work with animal justice.
Sure. For example, my partner and I lived in a food desert for a number of years. There were no grocery stores. There were virtually no restaurants. There were 8 liquor stores where we routinely see parents trying to buy food. What is the efficacy of vegan pamphleting in these areas? Additionally, there was a government-sponsored sign that says, "Eat 5 a day, fruits and vegetables," which tried to suggest the failure was somehow the people in the area who had, I don't know how they would have bought one fruit or vegetable. So from food deserts to the ability to pay a living wage, all of these industries are some of the most ruthless exploiters of labor in existence. The turnover rate at a CAFO is 100%. I actually didn't believe that when I first heard it. I was like, that can't be true, but it is true. They actually, within a year, replace every single person who works there. And the devastation on these workers' bodies is horrendous. And then anytime they complain, the industry, which itself recruits, I read one of these ads, they say, "We include housing," which really just tells you that they're just basically like company towns and these people can't really get out. So they work at the factory, they live at the house, that they pay for these apartments with each of their own rooms, free TV. So anytime they complain, then they call in ICE and they deport them and then they replace them with another one. I think one of the failures of our movement is that we have demonized people who work in CAFOs because we're like, they're bad people. They're the ones killing the animals without understanding that these people are making life and death decisions to support their family. No one wants to work in a CAFO with limited options. So not only is it like somehow how veganism can support economic issues of social justice, I would say we will never change the system we currently have if we stay resolutely single issue and don't think through issues of economic social justice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. Next up's Giuseppe.
Hi, greetings from Vienna in Austria. I like very much, hi Valis, I like very much your talk and your connection to to social justice and capitalism. Speaking from Europe, I don't know if in the US it's the same situation, but leftist movements in Europe, going back to Karl Marx, who defined those who try to protect animals as bourgeois, have a tradition of stigmatizing vegetarian and vegans. Yeah? So it's difficult to talk with them because meat is considered something that you succeeded, yeah? as a movement, liberation movement. So you partly you said it true. Yeah. Do you have any experience of dialogue with leftist movement who tend to see vegans as right wing?
That's a great question. Let me, before I start, just briefly, there's a question that came up with chat, and I apologize that I didn't define all the terms beforehand. I should have. A CAFO is a confined animal feeding operation. So it's the technical term for a factory farm. To your question, yes. There is a meme, people say it all the time, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. And they'll use that to try to argue against veganism. And I guess the two things that I would say is there is no ethical consumption of animals under any economic system. And two, I would say, yes, I agree with you. Let's work against both of them. And I'll give you one way in which this unity can make sense. Angela Davis, who is very committed to her critique of capitalism as well as prison abolition, actually hid that she was a vegan for a long time because of this kind of pushback of it seeing as somehow a personal lifestyle choice or consumeristic. And recently, fairly recently, and it was interesting, it was almost kind of a coming out process. She was embarrassed to say, she says, I've hid this, but I am now telling you that I am vegan. And she says, and what you have to understand is the greatest commodity fetish is meat. The product more than anything else that hides the labor conditions that produce it. Both those workers that I just talked about, who are arguably some of the most exploited workers on the planet, and the labor conditions of the animals themselves is in meat. So there is no reason why these insights from Marx, regardless of what Marx himself may have thought, cannot be used to critique the current global animal husbandry system.
Thank you.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Next was M.
Hey, greetings from Finland. Nice to see you, Vasile. Great talk. My question was similar to Esther's, so I don't want to be redundant, but I did want to ask if you had heard of the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which is sort of a stronger version of the Paris Agreement.
I have not, and I would be delighted if you would take a second to teach me about it.
Well, I think it's probably better worded on their website, but I can put a link in the chat just now.
Thank you.
Okay, I have actually a question in the chat from Nihal. It says, Anonymous for the Voiceless have tried to reclaim the word vegan and deny the title vegan to people who don't agree with their arguments against speciesism, but avoid animal products for primarily environmental reasons. I'd be interested to know how you feel about the monopolization of the word vegan. You've said that it is more than a diet and it's more than a social justice movement. Can people who are environmentally driven say that they are part of the vegan social justice movement? And does it serve purpose in controlling the word vegan from an anti-capitalist stance?
That is a great question. For many years, I used to say, oh, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Okay. For many years, I used to say that I was trying to be vegan. That didn't mean that I didn't exclusively avoid all forms of animal products, but it was just to acknowledge that it is actually impossible to be fully vegan if we understand it as causing no harm to non-human animals, since from tires to Band-Aids to sugar. I even try to boycott sugar, but you know, there are animal products in everything, to the houses that we live in. One of the committed animal rights activists I know just bought a new home in a big, you know, sub-development. And the reason he liked the home so much is that he could see deer. And he didn't seem to understand the reason he could see the deer is he was living in what was very recently their home. So vegan is an aspirational goal. It is a daily ethic. So I myself don't really spend that much time trying to police other people's veganism, but I do worry about the way that the industry is using these terms and creating new terms, and the way that some people of animal rights groups are trying to depoliticize the really radical nature of what is behind what I think veganism means.
Excellent, thanks. Richard.
Thanks, Corey. Hi, Vas. Nice to see
Hey,
you.
Richard. Good to see
Hope
you.
you can hear me well. I just thought I would try to, obviously I'm in agreement with your talk. So I just wanted to maybe ask something which is a bit more devil's advocate-y. I'm thinking about, you know, the people, the vegans who are indeed advocates of in vitro meat and vegan meat and so on. And I'm thinking of some, you know, there's quite a lot of people on Twitter who are quite quite sort of vocal on this, and you can sort of empathize with where they're coming from, because they kind of see it as a fast track to social change. They think by substituting and so on that we can have this fast track social change, which we don't seem to be getting through advocating animal liberation and so on. So I mean, I kind of, I'm sort of obviously on your side there, but I'm kind of empathetic with their position as well. And it just reminds me of some research that we did for the Vegan Society a couple of years ago. We did this report called Pathways to Veganism, which essentially the point of the project was to engage with non-vegans about how they think about veganism and how they construct veganism. And so we did questionnaires and focus groups and interviews. And, one of our main findings was that animal ethics meanings attached to veganisms were like the biggest, sort of turn off to veganism, and that people didn't want to engage with animal ethics arguments because, we can read that as well. It's the animal ethics arguments which are positioning them as morally in the wrong, and that's psychologically unpleasant, and so on and so forth. But it does end up perhaps implying that there is this difficulty for an animal liberation perspective when it's precisely animal ethics arguments that people don't want to hear in a big way, and so then that kind of feeds back to what are the best strategies for change and how you might frame animal ethics arguments so they might have more translatability and might be received better by people. Just wanted to know your thoughts on all that.
Well, thank you, Richard. There's obviously quite a lot in that question, so I'll try to break it down to its components parts. So the first one about in vitro meat. So first of all, I'm somewhat familiar to this experience because I used to speak about why I thought humane meat was a bad pathway forward, and vegans would get mad at me and argue with me after my speech and tell me I was wrong. And now I tell them why I think in vitro meat is a bad pathway forward, and in almost verbatim ways, even though many of them have now changed their mind about humane meat or grass-fed beef, they tell me I'm wrong and hurting the movement, and in vitro meat is the only way forward. And what is it, the comic where she has the football and he goes to kick the football and she pulls it away every time? It's how many times can we keep making the identical mistake? Indeed, the most famous proponents of in vitro meat are the exact same people who were the most famous proponents of humane meat before it. Once they realized humane meat wouldn't work, they literally moved on to a new consumerist idea. So the product changes, but the belief that consumerism is the way to win never changes. Related to that, the Good Food Institute, which is the largest vegan proponent of in vitro meat, recently released another study. So I debated Bruce, the CEO of the Good Food Institute at the University of Berkeley, on the topic of in vitro meat. It's free. I encourage everyone to watch the debate. You can get both sides. And I pointed out, as I did in my talk today, that there is almost no peer-reviewed evidence supporting the environmental claims of in vitro meat, that it will cause more carbon emissions, that is therefore not scalable. And so I think he took that to heart. So he has released a new study that made great headlines, saying, again, that in vitro meat would decrease the GHG emissions by 90%. The problem is it is not peer-reviewed. It was done by a consulting firm, Good Food Institute hired. And again, they made a bunch of assumptions which do not exist in any form of in vitro meat production currently. For example, to be specific, they assumed that the growth medium, by the way, I didn't even talk today, but the primary growth medium is the blood of unborn cows, but they assumed the new growth medium would have no carbon footprint whatsoever. And they assumed that all in vitro meat would be exclusively powered by renewable energy. Well, if you use those same criteria, you could commission a consulting firm to create a study that proved that Hummers were more environmentally efficient than a Honda Fit. If you assume there is no carbon to make the car in the first place, and you assume the car is entirely powered by alternative energy. But that does not, in fact, mean that a Hummer is more scalable or environmentally sustainable than a Honda Fit. We don't have a limitless amount of alternative energy. We actually need all the alternative energy we have. So I keep having this debate with people in vitro meat, which is how are you going to pay for the massive energy that your product is going to require? And no one has been able to give me an answer. So why are we wasting time on something that all the peer-reviewed evidence says won't work? twice. Related to your second question, which is, hey, people don't want to hear these arguments. There's opinion polls to back that up. So I spend a lot of time thinking about why people eat meat. And I have come to the conclusion of two theories. Like many types of things, there's kind of a spectrum. There's a smaller group of people who just love the violence, and only law is ever going to stop them. These are the people who go hunting. Why does anyone go hunting? They go on safari, that enjoy dogfighting. These people. It's not about protein, it's about a kind of pleasure they get in domination. So only legal efforts are ever going to stop this small group of committed speciesists. But there is a far broader group of people who actually, it's primarily through social pressure. So I tried to figure out exactly how many vegetarians there are in the United States, which is something you think you could just Google. And it took me months of research. And I finally found out that it is far higher than we ever hear. It's about 10% of the population and growing. But within that, I discovered that half of those people don't verbally identify as a vegan or a vegetarian. They're closet vegans. They're vegans, but they won't tell anyone. They follow the diet strictly, but they keep it to themselves. Kind of like that example of Angeline Davis, who was vegan for years, but wouldn't tell anyone. So one of the great lies that we have bought into, the biggest, meatest lie, is somehow it's human nature to eat meat. But there are tons of parenting guides filled with parents saying, hey, my children won't eat meat. And the answer is to grind the meat up with the fruit or sweet vegetables that they want. If it was human nature to eat meat, why are these questions happening? There was a study that came out from Harvard that found out that 8% of children in the United States become what they refer to as independent vegetarians. Their parents are not vegetarian. Their parents don't want them to be vegetarian. The children themselves become vegetarian. If it's human nature to eat meat against their own parents and social pressure, why are 8% of children in the United States going vegetarian, as I did at the age of 9, without any vegetarian parents? And there's even data that suggests that there are more children who go vegetarian and then leave as they go through life, which suggests that it's not the case that so many of us learn to be vegan as that we are teaching people to eat meat. And if we can stop doing that, I think we'll see a groundswell of support when people actually feel comfortable without the social pressure to come out and say, I'm vegan. There is also opinion polls that say vegans are some of the most stigmatized people. One study looked at and said vegans were more stigmatized than atheists, that were more stigmatized, according to the study. I'm not saying in any other form, but according to the study, more stigmatized than homosexuals, more stigmatized than any other group they looked at other than active drug users. Well, if that's true, why would anyone choose to become one of the most stigmatized groups? And why would they stay if they did? And why would they tell anyone if they did? So we always focus on the animals, and I get that, but we actually also have to focus on stigma against veganism because it's one of the major impediments in stopping change.
Excellent. Thanks again, Richard. Taj.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really thought-provoking. At one point you said something along the lines of, we can't have like the technology come before the ethics. We got to have the ethics come before the technology. And like, it kind of scares me, like how fast we got to decarbonize. And it's difficult to imagine like that sort of moral revolution happening within like the time frame we have left. And so I guess that's why like my intuition has always thought like we need some kind of tech revolution, like Richard was talking about, to like sidestep all that, like that moral revolution that would be necessary. And to me, it almost sounds like a better bet to like hope that we come up with some kind of sustainable in vitro technology, just because that moral revolution seems like so far out of reach, especially on a global scale. When you think about China and India, that also like need to go through that moral revolution and stuff. Yeah, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in your question. So I guess the first thing I would say is it is, in one sense, an absolute cliff and not. So we really do have now 9 years to try to prevent this 1.5 change. And any improvement we make still always helps. 1.5 is better than 2. 2 is better than 2.5. 2.5 is better than like the 7% the Trump administration was looking at. So there's never a point at which we stop because we've gone too far. We always just have to keep pushing. And the good news is that because of a growing awareness of the environmental effects of animal agriculture, we have seen a growth, a sea change of people who are thinking about decreasing meat consumption, both on a policy and an activist level that we've never seen before. And so that is very encouraging. But I want to sort of touch on something deeper, which is this belief that somehow technology alone will save us. And I would just say, can you think of any other social justice movement where technological innovation alone solved the problem? And if that answer is no, why do you think that would be true for either environmentalism or animal liberation?
Thanks
Then
again,
some
Tosh.
people argue about like fossil fuels like decreasing the need for slavery because like that allowed for like greater production without needing other humans. Like I wonder if something similar could happen in this way, that like the technology could help. I feel like people just got so much like a conflict of interest is the problem really. Like nobody really thinks factory farming is a good idea, I feel like, but like we so attached and hooked on the foods we eat in. So if we don't got that conflict of interest and instead we get in our foods from like, you know, something like in vitro, then like people are going to be like more open to the idea like speciesism is morally wrong. So it would be kind of like it removes that inhibitor, it removes that block. That's something I like kind of believe.
Well, I don't want to over-dominate the conversation, but I'll just make a few more points. So the first one is, I don't believe that race-based child slavery in the United States primarily ended because of technological innovation. And I think that's probably a distressing narrative to buy into. But I would also say that one of the common arguments made in favor of in vitro meat is they'll give the example of, look at the horse-drawn carriage that was replaced with the car. And this is example the Good Food Institute does. This was replaced with a car. That was a technological innovation. We didn't need to change any hearts and minds, and it decreased the suffering from the horses. Peter Singer makes this exact same argument. And I say that is exactly the right analogy. We replaced the horse with the car, and it is now causing massive more amounts of suffering. Or to express it another way, what will happen, even if there was some theoretical ideal form of in vitro meat, which there is not, there is no peer-reviewed evidence that shows it is scalable. It is worse in terms of climate change. But let's suppose for a second I'm wrong. Even if that existed, when it comes to market, agribusiness will simply buy the new technology. Tyson and Purdue are already investing in it. They don't care about the environment. They don't care about animals. They'll use it as a filler for the product, the same way they're using these other types of meat as fillers for the product. It'll just confuse consumers even more. So now when you try to explain what's wrong with meat eating, and you already have to explain grass-fed, and you already have to explain regenerative, you will then have to explain why cruelty-free meat actually really hurts animals or is worse for the environment. Under a capitalist system, we're never going to get any of these ideal systems because they will always be bought by the existing agribusiness, and they will decimate them the same way they do now.
Okay, thanks again, Taj. We have time for one more question. Gertrude is here. I'm terrible at pronouncing Dutch names. Don't kill me. If you want to take us out with your last question.
Hello, Vasile. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for coming.
Yep.
Hi, Gertrude from Belgium. That was a brilliant speech. Again, thank you very much. And I hope one day you will come to the International Animal Rights Conference in Luxembourg to give a talk there, because it's very much needed, especially your critical stance that I share on so-called clean meat. But my question is very basic. When I talk about capitalist veganism, and the need to tackle also capitalism. The reply that one of the bingo replies that I get is that the exploitation and the oppression of humans and other animals also happens under other non-capitalist systems, socialist systems, communist systems. So what is your reply to that? How do you deal with a reply like that?
I appreciate that question. And so I think your question works as a perfect kind of rejoiner to the other one, because weirdly we get it both ways. So people will say, well, what about capitalism? There can't be any ethical consumption under capitalism. And they'll say, well, not capitalism, there's still speciesism. And the answer is yes, you're right. That's why we have to have both. We have to critique both speciesism and we have to critique capitalism together. I will add a subpoint though, which is that I'll say that different ways of thinking, for example, more socialist countries, one of the great benefits is that often people would think less individualistically, which is itself kind of a product of capitalism, less, well, what is it that I have to do? So particularly in the US context, virtually anytime there's a discussion of climate change, it will include a virtually useless list of things people are supposed to individually do, like change their light bulbs or shower less. In terms of individualist change, by far the greatest thing anyone could do is go vegan, but even individually going vegan isn't going to get us where we need to get. We have to have collective action, we have to have ideally collective legal change, and we have to have it fast. And so capitalism isn't just money, it's a way of thinking, and thinking I individually have to solve the problem is the problem.
Excellent. Thanks everybody for these really thought-provoking questions. I don't think we were able to get all the questions in, but we do need to be mindful of time. Vasile is always very welcoming to emails, right? If people want to reach out to you. Yeah. So thank you once again. So I really loved about this talk that you were addressing folks who are not vegan, but also people who are vegan, and left everybody with a lot to think about. And it's really challenged us in a good critical way. So thank you once again. This has been an amazing talk, and we're really honored to have you here.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you everyone who came today and everyone who is doing anything to help with animals. I know what you go through. I cannot be more grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for vegansociology.com if you want more programming like this, and we'll see you around next time.
Thanks very much, Vasile.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.